back, everyone. A new mindset is taking over in the United States where you have individuals being encouraged to report on their neighbors. Now, here to talk to us about this new totalitarian mindset is Dinesh D'Souza, author and writer. And Dinesh, real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
Thank you. Great to be on.
So we saw some recent news updates on this. We see people posting videos online, doxing people where they release their identities and try to identify them and call them out for not really crimes, but more like political crimes, political correct crimes. I know you've done some videos on this. What's the phenomena you've been watching with this?
Well, I think it started with COVID, at least as far as I can see. People suddenly get this idea that reporting on their neighbors and reporting on other people, they report on someone at the airport, hey, that guy took off his mask, and so on. It's what strikes me is not only the fact that people have this concern with health and they feel like, okay, I got to protect myself, but they take a certain, I would call it malicious delight in trying to get other people busted. Now, this notion of reporting on others, this is a very socialist phenomenon, and we saw it in Russia and the Soviet Union, we saw it in China under Mao. We see it in Venezuela today under the socialist regime, in which kids are encouraged to report on parents and vice versa. You're encouraged to tell on your neighbors. And so there's a tyrannical mindset here, but we don't see it partly because I think we have this stereotypical idea that a tyrant has to look like Stalin. He has to have a Cossack outfit and a toothbrush mustache and very cold eyes. But tyranny isn't like that. It's a much more widespread instinct. In fact, I think it's part of human nature. It's the desire to sort of arbitrarily use force and dominate other people. Now, most people have that impulse, but they don't have enough power to carry it out. So the tyrannical impulse plus power makes for a very dangerous individual.
And we've seen examples of this. I mean, if we look at the old Soviet era type, Cold War criticisms on the U.S. side, one of the big criticisms on the U.S. side was watching these kids report on their parents. And the parents were taken off and executed or thrown in the gulag, and the kids were awarded. And Americans were horrified when they saw news about this. We've seen examples of this now happening in the United States where kids, oftentimes more of the social justice mindset, are reporting on their parents. Whether it's in the school systems, whether it's in the January 6th incident, where they're reporting on people. We've seen this. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, George Orwell describes this in 1984. He talks about the fact that the children had become essentially savages. Now he goes, you might think that this is because they're kids, they're nonconformists, and no, he goes, they are conformists when it comes to the party, what Orwell calls Big Brother. They're the kids, he says, are very eager to play by the rules. They march in lockstep. He goes, but when it comes to their friends or when it comes to their parents, and their neighbors, they're very eager to tell on them. They love to see the van show up and this guy then disappears. So it's remarkable how there's this desire. I think it's rooted in part in envy, the sense that we take a certain resentment toward other people, particularly people who are seen as more beautiful, more successful. You'd love to see them pulled down. And the other word I'm looking for is the German word called Schadenfreude, which basically means taking pleasure in somebody else's misery. So some other guy's being dragged off by the cops, you're like, hey, that's the tyrannical impulse. You take a certain delight in that.
And on that too, one thing I've been kind of witnessing, I think, or seeing more commonly is that it seems like a lot of people who do this are people who don't normally seem to have power or authority. You often see it among the weaker type people, right? Physically weak, spiritually weak, who seem to use the power of government in some ways, or the authority of government as their system of authority. And even though they claim to oppose, let's say even some of them calling for defunding the police, some of them calling against government authority, as you said, really do delight in the ability to use government and state power for their own benefit. I mean, how does this dynamic work, do you think?
The way it works is take someone like Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. Yes. So Whitmer, in an earlier era, would be, I would call her the village nag. So she'd stand in some street corner, look at this guy, and hey, look, isn't that so-and-so's daughter? Why is she with so-and-so's son? And so on. So, and she'd be like heckling people. So everybody would run away from her, They'd see her, they'd go, oh my God, cross the road. Her husband would be like looking for time outside of the house and so on. So someone like that, once they become the governor of Michigan, suddenly they have the National Guard, the police force. It's essentially this little nagging tyrannical impulse weaponized. And then under COVID, suddenly Whitmer realizes, wait a minute, if I tell everybody they have to stay indoors, they have to stay indoors. I can tell a church to close and they have to shut their doors. So I have this sort of emergency power, and I kind of like it. So someone who in principle would be opposed to Stalin or Lenin likes being a little Lenin, and they get used to it. And then suddenly they begin to realize, I don't really want the lockdown to end, because if the lockdown ends, suddenly I'm now accountable to the legislature. Suddenly all these powers that I had go away. So you see, particularly among Democratic mayors and governors, this secret desire to hold on to COVID power as long as possible.
No, and this leads into something unique we're seeing in society right now, which is in the United States, government power, when it comes to COVID, additional powers they've given themselves, are going in one of two directions. We're in Texas right now, and in Texas they've opened up the street. In other words, the government has relinquished many of these new powers they've given themselves. Recently, I just came from New York, and in New York it's the opposite. The government is maintaining a lot of the powers, but granting citizens back some of their rights on condition that they get, for example, these vaccine passports or whatever. And so we see one of two situations, that the nature of freedom is changing. In some states, again, the government is just relinquishing the control of your freedoms. In some other states, like New York, the government is keeping their powers, but freedom is then something granted to you by the government.
Right. So I think you see here loosely the Republican and the Democratic model. The Republican model is that, and Texas is a good example. Texas actually had mask restrictions. There was, kind of a run on the hospitals. The governor sort of panicked, and so he's like, shut the state down, and he did. But he came under tremendous pressure and attack. In fact, 2 or 3 other guys go, we're running for governor. Suddenly, Governor Abbott, who's a very popular governor in Texas, lost his sheen, lost his magic. He became a controversial figure. It was not clear that he would be reelected, for example. And then he backpedaled very quickly, and he was like, okay, listen, yes, if the Kroger grocery store wants to have a mask mandate, they can, but it's no longer a Texas mandate. And that's the Republican way. And by and large, I think the people who have been up front on this have been people like Kristi Noem in South Dakota, of course, Governor DeSantis in Florida. Now, the Democratic states, you see the opposite. And it's almost as if the Democratic states are betting that people prefer the security of a lockdown to what you could call the risk of freedom. And right there you see the ideological divide in the United States. Now, the difference, I think, even on the Democratic side between now and the past, is the Democrats used to be for safety in the economic domain. So we're going to give you, family income, and we're going to give you unemployment, and we're going to give you this, and we're going to give you that. But the Democrats assumed that their constituents wanted their civil rights. They never assumed that their constituents wanted their free speech taken away or their right to assemble taken away. But I think now the Democrats are sort of going full scale. Well, we want to protect you not only economically, but we kind of want to protect you even from the risk of freedom.
That's an interesting concept, the risk of freedom. And we do see it. If we look at what's happening right now under COVID, many of our constitutional rights have been taken away. The right to freedom of worship, churches were shut down. The right to freedom of speech, a lot of speech, especially criticizing the mandates and criticizing some of the different doctrines coming out from the World Health Organization. You were not allowed to say it online. You could be attacked. A lot of that was enforced more through like the social level of things. Again, we see even illegal searches and seizures to some extent being used, at least politically, maybe not illegal, but used politically. With what happened with Giuliani, for example, we see attacks on Second Amendment. And we see our constitutional rights being whittled away. What is this kind of want for stripping away these rights that you're talking about, this protection from freedom itself? It's an interesting concept.
Well, I think that the left politically has become completely unhinged. And we see this in all our institutions, one after the other. Institutions that were supposed to be neutral, the police agencies, the government, have become politicized. The left is trying to politicize the military. And they're doing it in the name of rooting out extremism. The Constitution, well, there was an academic debate between the left and the right about the Constitution that's gone on for 30 years, in which the left would talk about the living Constitution. The Constitution is kind of this evolving document. Its meaning is sort of somewhat elastic over time. But that debate, by and large, did not apply to things like free speech or freedom of assembly, nor did it apply to things where the Constitution spoke really clearly, like you have to be 35 years old to run for president. You know, that's set in stone. What the left meant was when you're talking about things like equal protection or non-discrimination, those terms can be elastic enough. They may have started out with race, but maybe they can include gender. Or what they meant was things like the abortion right, you know, is protected under a broader privacy right. But all of this has now given way to, I would say, a wholesale attack on basic freedoms. Now, the wholesale attack is not just carried out by the government, but it's carried out sometimes by the government in coordination with the private sector, people like the digital moguls. So people will say things, and some libertarians will say things like, well, you know, we can't object to Twitter censorship because, you know, this is a private company. But the fact is, the head of Twitter and the head of Facebook often go before Congress, and Congress then starts shouting at them, why aren't you censoring more people? We demand that you censor this, and we demand you censor that. So it's not as if these private institutions are operating in a vacuum. They are under congressional protection because of Section 230, and they are also under pressure from Congress, the Democratic Congress, to do the bidding of one side of the ideological aisle.
Well, and that's a concerning development, because the government use of private business to carry out basically mandates that violate the Constitution, meaning that government can't do it, right? And so instead of the government doing it, they're going through private industry to do it because it gets around the constitutional restrictions. I mean, this is a concerning development, especially ironically, if you understand how fascism works, which is this kind of cooperation between the government system and, you know, business, the corporate system. I mean,
for sure. The Nazis' term was Gleichschaltung, which is essentially conformity, coordination. The Nazis said the universities have to basically sing out of our hymn book, and the media has got to promulgate our doctrines, and the movies and entertainment industry has to essentially glorify the Nazi state. And ironically, we have, you know, obedient media institutions that actually do that without even the government sometimes even having to make a phone call. So that, I think, is a scary development. And it means we have become I won't say we're an unfree society, but we are a less free society than when I first came to America a generation ago. That America that I took for granted is, if it's not, I won't say it's no more, but we seem to be moving in a different direction.
Well, this all ties into something interesting, which you mentioned, which is this developing fear of freedom. And I think that hits it on the head, really, because that's the way it's being painted, that freedom of speech, that there is some speech that is dangerous. Freedom of assembly, there's some assembly that is dangerous. That the rights and freedoms we have, you cannot trust to the masses, and so the government should somehow restrict it. But what does restriction look like? I mean, where's this heading?
We've learned two things, I think, recently. One is that the government will impose a set of laws under one pretext, let's just say fighting terrorism. And then suddenly they'd create a database. But instead of creating a database of terrorists, they create a database of all Americans. And their goal is to, quote, filter out the terrorists. But you suddenly realize that we are putting terrifying power in these people's hands, which not only can, but will and is being abused. The second thing is that COVID is a little bit like an emergency. So they're able to produce all these guys in the white coats. Of course, Fauci is the kind of comic symbol of all this. But the basic idea is the doctor says. Now, see, we're all used to going to the doctor, and the doctor says, you know, I got to take your appendix out. And you don't know enough to say, no, you don't. You know, so by and large, we're used to submitting to medical recommendations. If they give you a prescription, you take it. So the government realized with COVID, here is a kind of an amazing opportunity. People are used to doing what the doctor says. And so we can sort of go on a wartime footing, which is to say, just as in wartime, basic rights do get suspended. The suspensions are intended to be temporary, but we're doing things under COVID that were never done even a century ago under the Spanish flu epidemic and others. We have gone into unprecedented territory. I think that's been a very bad thing.
Now, as this happens, I think a lot of conservatives more so tend to look to the Supreme Court to protect them from government overreach. And I think a lot of people are putting their hopes in the courts that over government, when it comes to violating constitutional rights or other protections we're supposed to have, that the courts are going to step in and block that from happening. I guess first off, what is the basis of this mentality? And where are the courts with this?
The courts have been, on the religious freedom front, in recent decisions, they have been somewhat protective of religious freedom. And I say somewhat because essentially what the courts have done is they have stepped in and said, they've given, I think, Governor Newsom now like 4 or 5 consecutive like whacks. But the courts have taken a middle position, and their middle position is this. Hey, Governor Newsom, you're allowing the salons and the bars and all these commercial facilities and even games to occur under certain conditions. And then you're saying to the church, you can't do the same thing that all these commercial establishments are doing. And that is a violation of religious freedom, right? So by and large, what the courts are saying is that you can restrict churches, but you can't restrict them more than you restrict other non-theological institutions. But see, if you actually read the Constitution, it goes much further than that. The Constitution basically says Congress shall make no law, and Congress here is not only the federal government, but applies also to the states, restricting the free exercise of religion, period. It doesn't say, well, except in the case of an epidemic, or except if no, it is a right declared in, you may almost say, absolute language. And what that means, I think, is that there should be a presumption, a heavy burden of proof on the state to prove that this regulation is absolutely necessary. Not just you think it would be kind of a good idea, but that this is an absolutely necessary measure, because otherwise you're flatly taking a pickup truck and driving over the Constitution.
And when it comes to the courts, I think the reason a lot of people turn to the courts is because they believe that the courts will look at the technical details of the law free from political bias. At least that's the hope. Where do you see things at with the courts?
I think with COVID, the courts have run a little bit scared because, see, the court doesn't want to be, the court is not an adjudicator of health, or they're not in a position to make these kinds of decisions. They don't know what the CDC is necessarily saying. So they don't want to make a decision where they say, okay, you can do this, and then 4,000 people die, and then people look at the judge and go, you did that. So the court has been very deferent, by and large, to the executive branch, because they don't want to sort of, you may say, take the responsibility. Part of the problem, I think, also is the conservative doctrine of what has been called judicial restraint, which is for the court to play the low-key role. See, I think this is a misunderstanding of what a judge does. A judge should not be restrained. A judge should be restrained when it's not his call. So take a referee in a game. The job of the referee is not to make the rules, right? Someone else makes the rules, but the judge is supposed to make the call. It's the ball in or out. You can't invent the rules, but it is your job to vigorously apply the rules and make all the tough calls that need to be made. So I think judges need to be activist in doing their job and restrained in not trying to do other people's job.
The other thing we see in this country right now is this rise of political correctness and social justice. And, the historical context of these is important. Political correctness, 1967 Mao Zedong. It's a moral system based on politics, not based on religious values or traditional values. And so if you violate the political standards, like opposing the Cultural Revolution, you're an enemy of the state, and you can face whatever crime, whatever punishments they want to mete out. And social justice is justice meted out from the social level, not from a legal level. And we see both of these playing out now. We see people calling for justice, not legal justice, but social justice. And I'm curious where you see things heading with this, because it is starting, it seems, to influence the courts.
I think we're seeing the pivoting issue on this whole thing is the race issue. It's the one issue I find, as someone who grew up in a different culture, it's the one issue in which Americans lose their minds. And we talked earlier about the shock of freedom. I think that where we went wrong is that in the 1950s and 60s, the country for the first time took stock of its own history. And said, not that all Americans did this, but that there were gross violations of the rights, particularly of blacks. And in that sense, the country said, we have some responsibility to fix this. But the problem was responsibility to do what, right? I think that blacks at that point were behind other groups in development, behind in academic development, behind in savings rates, behind in rates of entrepreneurial formation, so behind in all the skills that are necessary to succeed. Now, interestingly, immigrants come to America and they might be poor, but they have those skills. They have intact families, they have an entrepreneurial ethic. If you tell them, I'll pay you double, they're willing to work 20 hours a day. They've already got all that. But because of history and because of past oppression, blacks did not have those cultural skills. But the country, and this is really liberal policy, decided we're not going to invest in doing that. What we're going to do instead is we, the society, will kind of take responsibility for, quote, looking after these people. And the net effect of it 50 years later is you have now a dependent population, particularly in inner cities, relying on the government, unable to fend for itself. The Democrats don't really mind because it delivers 90% of the vote into their camp. If these people became self-reliant like the Vietnamese or like the Thai or the Asian Indian immigrants, they would just go, okay, I'm going to move out of the inner city. I'm going to try to get to a suburb. I'm going to have a different life. I'm not relying on the Democratic Party. So the Democrats weirdly fear the freedom of these groups because freedom in that sense means freedom from dependency on the political party that right now pays the mortgage, delivers the food, and essentially manages the lives of these dependent, quote, minorities.
I know you touched on some of this in your book, The Big Lie, as well, where there's almost a trade-off with big government, where they can maintain actual oppression. They can maintain poverty as long as you have a dependent population that needs the type of overreach of government that they're offering. And it's not in their interest to lift people out of that state, as you were saying, that the solution, I think, would have been to find ways to uplift them, which is what Trump was doing, actually, in his last days in office, where he was creating programs to give business loans to Black Americans and help Black communities, build out of the situations they've been placed into.
Right.
And it's a very different concept from maintaining poverty versus uplifting out of poverty, giving people the tools and abilities to lift themselves out of it.
Absolutely. I mean, when I came to America, I did not know anything about American history, for example. And so when I was taking the SAT to get into college, there were two paths available to me, right? I could say, oh, you know what? There's a lot of American stuff I don't know, so I need to learn it. The other option would be for me to say things like, wait a minute, why is the SAT being given in English? I want Hindustani. It's systemic racism that I'm being asked to comment on American culture when I was raised in India. Ask me about Gandhi, So if I went that way, I would be a totally different type of person. In fact, right now, I wouldn't be as successful. I would be some miserable chronic complainer. And all the other Indians would be like, this guy's a kook. But that's because the Asian Indian community recognizes that these are the cultural ingredients of success. You want your kids to do well, they need to study really hard. You want to have successful businesses, you got to save capital and invest it and work really hard. So there's no other way, though the recipe for success is known. But for the Democrats and for the left, they treat those meritocratic criteria for success as themselves forms of oppression. So if you were to say, hey, listen, we need to work on strengthening the Black family, they would go, what? We need to improve, for example, the amount of homework that kids do, for example, in public schools. They go, what? They would react with outrage to the known formulas for people moving ahead in life. And the simple result is every other group comes with less They kind of check into the inner city where they realize I've got to live here for 15 minutes. So I'm going to work really hard, and then as soon as I can, I'm going to move out. And you see this. They move into inner city Washington, D.C. You know, not even a generation later, they're in Arlington or they're in Fairfax. And so the upward mobility story is going on all over America. It's just that the Democrats are doing their best to stop it.
And I think this ties into one of the important parts of what socialism really is, which is the socialism. Socialism is not the lifting up of people. It's not the giving people the tools to become independent, to become self-reliant. It is the tearing down of those who are successful. In other words, it's a tearing down and not a building up. Whereas you want to uplift people who are in dire straits or who are not, having trouble reaching success because they're not able to get the benefits that are, available. They can't find them. It's not helping those people. It's taking people who are successful, tearing them down, and then using some of the kickbacks that the government pockets some and gives some kickbacks to people who help them basically into power.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I understand it slightly differently. The way I look at it is that the socialist class is itself an elite. But in a commercial society, the greatest rewards don't go to these people, because these are journalists, they're lawyers, they're activists. And in an entrepreneurial society, it's the people who are the most successful are people like Steve Jobs, people who create new things. And so this group of people, these elites, socialist elites, become very resentful. And they go, how do we take power away from those guys and put it in our hands? And their answer is, so it's not just that they are pulling successful people down, they're conducting a vicious power struggle inside the society. And I call this group the people of words, because by and large they produce nothing. What does Jim Acosta produce? He produces words. Now, you and I produce words. But the difference between us and Jim Acosta is his are words of resentment that are ultimately aimed at transferring power away from the entrepreneurial class, which makes stuff, to a political class that then, has the commanding heights of the economy. And that's really the goal of the socialists. They're looters, I think is the phrase Ayn Rand used, and they're looters in that sense, that they know that once they're in control, they get to tell the business guys what to do and shake them down for money. So they use power as a mechanism to then get money. I mean, look at the way in which Al Gore, the Clintons, Biden, they've all become fabulously rich through government. They haven't invented anything. They don't have a patent. They haven't started a business. They're able to essentially rent out their political office and use that access as a way of cashing in. Very different from, say, some guy who's runs 400 gas stations, for example. That guy provides services, sells stuff in exchange, and builds up wealth that way. These guys do it a totally different way.
And I think this shows the kind of overall ideological battle happening in the world right now, which I would define as really freedom versus socialism. You have one group that wants freedom. They want to have their rights. They want to have government protect their rights. There's the other side that wants really socialism, which is the opposite of that. It's state capitalism, which is one of the buzzwords they're pushing right now. It's one of the buzzwords they're pushing in China right now, where the government owns the capitalist system, sees the means of production, who controls the factories and the businesses. And that's one of the big deceptions around socialism as well, that it gets rid somehow of the capitalist systems. No, it takes that and puts it under state control is what it does. Now, where do you see this social debate, which has really become global, heading right now between these two sides? And do you see it like this?
So the way I see it is that the socialists are a gangster class, and these are the people running roughshod over people's rights. If you think of America as two groups of people, one group of people which is the conservatives, does not approve of the way that the progressives live, but it's not our intention to control their lives. So in that sense, you would think, well, maybe the country could live and let live. The progressives live the way they want. They can choose progressive communities. The conservatives live the way they want. They choose conservative communities. But no, the progressives won't allow that. It's not enough for them that they control academia and the media and Hollywood. They want to control, the NFL. They want to control the Boy Scouts. They want to control children's books. They want to cancel books that they don't like. So the tyrannical mindset is on one side. Now, it seems to me that when you're up against that, and tyranny kind of bares its teeth, if you will, the old conservative strategy of sort of fighting in a gentleman's way through the normal channels of politics becomes obsolete. The reason there's a little division in the Republican Party, and there was over Trump, is partly because Trump instinctively is kind of a New York scrappy guy, and he realized, wait a minute, you can't do this. I'm gonna like hit back, So it was his normal temperament to do that, but he is not a normal Republican. The typical normal Republican is like some, suburban housewife or some guy who runs a business. They don't want to wear a button and be on the street, and they certainly don't want to set fire to something or go take over a courthouse. They're not like that. So conservatives, in a sense, have got to think about how do you fight differently under these new conditions that we find ourselves in. I'm convinced we need to do it. And part of what I try to do in my writing and also my podcast is to try to think through the kind of new conservatism, if you will, worldwide, that would be up to the challenge posed by the other side. In the same way, Lincoln had to figure this out. Lincoln came to Washington. He was a member of the moderate wing of the Republican Party, a rhino, we might say today, Republican in name only. But Lincoln realized that the Democrats had become gangsterized in the 1850s, and he realized, okay, listen, this is a new game. And the old